有人吗？测试一下声音好不好？
I'm Sean Rubenstein Dunlop. I'm a reporter with Four Corners on the ABC.
Hi, nice to meet you.
I overheard you speaking with Clive.
Yes.
And I'd love to talk to you
Yes.
more.
同学们，有声音没有？给我来个确认好不好？我待会儿要把这个麦克风夹到前面教授的领子上，有没有声音？给我回答一下哈。怎么上来就没声了呀？没错，刚才是被我静音了哈。因为刚才那段声音不想播出去是吧？今早直播嘛是吧？现在有了，好，行，我先把这个麦克风，我准备夹在那个教授身上。Sorry, excuse me again.
That's all right, I'll be moved.
Right. 今天有个教授在这儿演讲哈，我今天来给你们现场直播。今天带了2个麦克风，这个麦克风会夹在教授的领子上啊。今天的演讲题目是 China's Influence in Australian Universities。我不知道我声音清楚不清楚啊。我待会儿把这个麦克风夹在他领子上，我就算完成任务了。然后我就跟你们一起来看他的演讲，有可能我来做一些及时的、简单的翻译啥的，但是不能保证100%正确啊。刚才那个 ABC Four Corners 的记者找我要了联系方式，他说希望跟我多聊一聊，可能我们接下来会有很多英语节目的，希望大家多关注吧。我也不知道声音清楚不清楚啊，我看见我来看看你们有没有跟我连线的啊。来瞧一瞧，看看我自己的形象好不好啊？Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we'll just see where...
It's more clip. Just outside.
That way?
No, clip
That way.
facing outside. Yeah, that's great.
How? Which way?
This is a microphone. It's
okay.
Pointing outside will be fine.
Okay, so that needs to go out that way?
Yes.
Okay.
That's great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Now, I need to be mic'd up with the...
So you got powerful.
Yeah.
瞧瞧我自己的，我声音好不好呀？啊？
Start maybe 5 minutes or something after the
给我打个字儿，告诉我刚才的声音好不好？
congregated outside by books and things. So we'll sort of wait until give people 5 minutes or something.
But look at this, 500 booked.
也没人
Hundreds
了
on。the waiting list.
Yeah.
But for free events,
Yeah.
people make up their
Berna,
mind
杂音呢？
on the
On the
day.
day,
Yeah.
yeah.
可以啊。
So this is
自己
this is
听听
not
情况，
unusual. I
自己
mean,
听
more
听
will come in.
什么样的
but
杂音？
Yeah.
Yeah, you think, oh, it's going to be packed. It won't fit everyone in, but it's consistently when it's a free event. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that there are people trickling in though. I think we'll fill at least a kind of the front.
Yeah.
人来了不少啊
Yeah, sure.
人来多少？
But it looks like a good audience. Do you recognise any?
人来的真是很多，我给你看看来多少人啊！
In there.
声音现场声音很好是吧？
Some from Griffith. This is actually from Griffith.
这还没说满呢，还在往里走，还有大概10分钟吧，还有10分钟开始
My
啊。
mum, she's from architecture.
I see University
I've
of
not seen
Queensland.
any
Yes, yes.
academic staff
University
that
of
are
Queensland.
to senior levels. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say.
Not unexpected.
Not unexpected. Yeah. So I'll just go check again how they're doing up the front.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. And but I should get mic'd up. I
Yeah.
think.
All right. Well, let's mic you up, and then yeah, if as long as you're happy to kind of delay it by 5 minutes.
西斯会在台上讲话吗？不会不会，画面有点卡顿呢，画面有点卡顿，那就先暂时这样吧。我现在没办法解决画面暂时有点卡顿的状况。
Ah, you're the tech guy too.
Everything guy.
Now it's the PPE Society, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
Politics, philosophy,
Philosophy
and
and
economics.
沙哑，有点沙哑，是因为他那个教授在这个墙背后，现在他现在在墙背后，现在没办法接收到他的声音信号。我的麦克风夹在他身上了啊，他在这个水泥墙背后，所以说有点声音干扰。等一会儿他出来就好了。
We'll turn it on and perhaps you
你们
can
听见我声音吗？我的声音好不好？
and it'll come over the audio.
来了来了，点赞点赞啊！小粉红进不来，知道吧？小粉红可能在这里边当间谍的，但是进不来。有前面这是一个这个会场啊，你需要翻译吗？有点卡。
But it's we did test it beforehand for volume.
Turned on, I'll just test it. Test.
All right.
Okay, goes on the
And
belt.
it's just a switch on the side. So if you did want to.
Yeah, okay.
Are you alright with placement of that one?
You just put that on there behind, yeah, just right there.
There we go.
粉红呢？粉红没在，粉红没在。
Oh, you just
Go
kind of
go，
air
西
it.
斯啊！
All right, okay.
Thanks for your patience. We might just leave it 4 or 5 minutes before we get started. I've been told that there are still some people trickling in, so if you just want to keep chatting. Thanks.
啊，我今天是否能直播？今晚是否能直播？那得等会儿看了，看他们玩到几点。网易热线可能要推迟或顺延，或者是取消都有可能的啊。
Yeah, no, I'll just come back and see you in a few minutes before we start. Thank you.
教授演讲的题目是中共如何影响澳洲大学。
Hello, Jonathan.
Professor
Official photographer.
Clive Hamilton
The frameless rimless glasses.
在布里斯班的昆士兰大学。
These are fantastic. I love them.
I think they're slick. I like it. Yeah, you don't reckon?
No, I do.
Oh,
I
yeah,
think I think that's terrific.
There's something like minimalist about it.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like only what you need in that.
Yeah, that's right. And they're extremely hardy. You know, you think, oh, are they going to be tough? But they are.
The first thing they tell you is they're not. You're gonna keep pulling off and on. They might like crack around the area. But
Well, I mean, I'm sure if you've got cheap ones.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I figured.
Yeah.
I got some specs there for like $400 and they better be good.
Yeah.
Yeah. You excited today?
人不多呀，
I saw that your professor is
布里斯班没错，大概还有5分钟嘛，5分钟就开始了。
bit of a trick.
Yeah,
A little bit.
There's a direct flight though, so
哎，坐下看你们聊天行吗？
2 hours late.
哎呀，我这个
Expecting any. I mean, I was part of the society that arranged this. I remember the executive meeting. They were like, "Oh, we put out an event. And if there's like less than 50 people from like can we?"
我这声音清楚吗？
500.
Fantastic.
我自己听一听啊。
Yeah, very good.
Should be fun.
哎，我的声音很清楚，那边它有噪音，是因为它有隔挡啊，不要紧，那个不要紧。
No, I got a photo of you with the
-8
your
Huh?
the mind.
看着挺好啊。行，我在另外一个手机上看着你们
Go.
聊
Anthony
天啊，
Chan
我跟你们一起聊天啊。
in my book. That's why he approached. He was a person who was kind of penalised for his pro-democracy
赞，加油，小扳手出现
activity.
啊！
Yeah.
主讲中共如何影响澳洲大选，今天估计讲完了，
How long is
明天可能会有电视台来采访我的啊。
Half is the entire. Yeah, so a couple of short talks, 5-minute openers, and then my lecture, and then the Q&A at the end.
Doesn't coverage channel 4, 7, 10 SBS or something?
Really?
I think so. I
Full
think
house.
Yeah.
反了吗？
If they all show up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, leave it to it. We'll see you around anyway.
引体不是引体，不是引体。澳洲人也苏醒吧！希斯呐喊 CCP Nazi。
From Central Florida.
Okay.
Waiting.
Terrific. Oh, okay. So have you guys been covering the telescope pretty intensively?
他因为那个教授现在的麦克风离着在墙背后、水泥墙背后会有干扰，所以说等一会儿就知道了。引体熬夜不好啊，引体现在该睡觉了啊，都1点了吧？啊，引体现在几点？我看看，引体1点半了，睡觉去吧，引体。
When we should just uncover evidence, we actually have to be at the heart of it.
哎呀，理工男都是熬夜熬出来的，是吧？
Yes. Yeah.
Because we didn't want there to be any fire. We needed most of what we did. The main questions. Because otherwise, I feel like we
最爱希斯哥，
they were of course we had to realize that
这都是闹革命不睡觉的是吧？那没办法呀，你想想我们，哎呀，看我们网易热线的一天也有6、7千人是吧？每天都有那么多人熬着夜不睡觉，还有上闹钟醒来专门打电话的，
Quite fascinating.
为了打倒 CCP 可以不睡觉。
The role it's played in the kind of broader Australian debate.
well, it's interesting in terms of Australia and foreign countries where they're at.
战友们都太可爱了，白宫只差6000个了，哎呀，太棒了，加油加油啊！白宫的签名必须赶快签去啊！
What this proved is that they were also able to organise independently. They had their own leadership. So if they realised that the Londoners in Sydney realised
白
just
宫
that
只
they
有
had
6000。
political force as well, electoral force.
四哥今天演讲内容是什么？中共如何影响澳大利亚大学？今天的演讲内容是这个。
And we just are very fortunate to have a very
干死 CCP。
centralised ticketed system. We don't have the rep select system that they have in the southern universities, so we're actually quite protected from that.
How does that work? How does that
So because you elect
噪音太大，噪音先我先把他的麦克风关掉啊。噪
the
音太
election
大。
becomes dependent on who has the most count.
好，现在没噪音了吧？我把他麦克风静音了。等一会儿他那个什么，轮到他讲了，咱们再把他麦克风打开哈。希斯哥，你对我太好了 ，Christy Flower。 我签了好几批没有确认邮件啊，签名达不到确认邮件的，请去看一看那个你的垃圾邮件箱junk mail， 要看一看那里啊。洛杉矶华人都支持你，好，谢谢。中共如何影响澳洲大学？内容好是吧？内容就是这个，中共如何影响澳洲大学。现在声音好了，因为现在是细哥的一个麦克风在响呢，那个教授的麦克风被我静音了。Professor Clive Hamilton。QA 有孔子学院，这个学校我现在坐的这个位置就有孔子学院，昆士兰大学就有孔子学院，这些学生们正在努力把这个孔子学院赶出去呢，正在努力中啊。这边6点40分是吧？我不会上台演讲的，还没轮到我呢，别着急，西哥总有一天会出来英文演讲的，你们别着急啊，先让我在这儿混个脸熟，行吧？咱们混个脸熟，这些教授和这些大学的老师、学生都认识我了啊！咱们有一天啊，不会太远的，有一天细哥也上来给你们做英文演讲，我也愿意在这个地方演讲一会儿，是吧 ？NSW 孔子学院即将年底全部关闭，太棒了！小心5毛到现场刺杀，我的妈呀！他要现场来这刺杀，可是我可就成了大新闻了，我也就成了民族英雄了，是吧？他不一定能刺杀得到我。不说话了，我今天就不给你们翻译了啊！你们这地方不适合说话，太安静了。
So, thank you everyone, and welcome to this evening's event. Firstly, I would just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on whose land we are holding this public lecture, the Jagera and Turrbal people. I'd like to recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to thank our host for this evening, the UQ Politics, Philosophy and Economic Society. As a member of the Society, I'm very glad that we're able to facilitate an event which we expect to drive forward an important national and international conversation around the influence of the Chinese Communist Party in Australia. I also strongly encourage you, if you're not already a member, to join the UQ PPE Society to support us in putting on future events like this one. It's probably already obvious to you, but the event is being filmed and live streamed, so if you are a person in a position where you may not want to be caught on camera, that's just something to keep in mind. It goes without saying that we're all here to see Professor Clive Hamilton, a true giant of Australian philosophical and political discourse, who I will formally introduce in a few moments. However, to provide context for Clive's visit, I would first like to welcome 2 student speakers. The first speaker is Drew Pavlou, who that's a name that will be familiar to many of you in the room. Drew is a student of history, philosophy and literature, and a passionate political campaigner for democracy and human rights. The second speaker is Jack Yu, who will be known to listeners of Radio National, among other media. There's more to say about Jack, but I'll leave it to Drew to introduce him. So please put your hands together for Drew.
Thank you, everyone. So my name is Drew. I'm a third-year philosophy student at the University of Queensland. On July 24th, I helped organise a peaceful protest at UQ, criticising our university's close ties to the Chinese state, while that government sanctions violent force against Hong Kong protesters and locks up millions of Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps, subjecting them to beatings, forced indoctrination, and forced sterilisations. Unfortunately, I was one of a number of students assaulted by pro-CCP nationals on the day. punched in the ribs and the side of the head and thrown to the ground. My coordinator group masked me. Later in the day, a man wearing a mask depicting skeletal teeth snuck up behind me and struck me in the back of the head. Hong Kong students were assaulted and chokeslammed to the concrete. Later, my personal details were posted on Chinese social media. I received hundreds of abusive messages and attacks across Facebook, Messenger, Instagram, and Twitter. I estimate that I received thousands of death threats. Hundreds would be a bit crazy. I probably wouldn't be standing here if I had hundreds of death threats. Probably would have actually got to me. So the worst death threats, though, were not against me, they were against my family. And the content of these messages were quite horrifying. They included threats to hit men on the dark web, to murder my brother and sister, murder my parents, rape my mother while I watched. Just absolutely horrifying stuff. And at least 3 other Chinese and Australian students present at the protest on July 24th were sent death threats and abusive messages of this sort of character. At least one student from mainland China saw his family back home receive a special visit from officials threatening them for his protest activities in Brisbane, Australia on July 24th. So for his presence at the University of Queensland, this guy had his family back home have a special midnight knock on the door. And it just, I guess, it shows the reach of the Chinese state, that they can identify students in Brisbane, Australia, and be able to organise for their family to receive a special visit. It shows, I guess, just the absolute reach of the Chinese surveillance state. Sadly, ultimately, UQ's response to this terrifying violence and intimidation was the crackdown on peaceful student protesters. We sadly faced tremendous pressure from the university to cancel any future protests critical of the CCP. In crisis meetings on July 25th, UQ's Deputy Vice-Chancellor Joanne Wright told UQ's Student Union Executive, "You have to stop Drew Pablo from holding the next protest on the 31st. You have to shut it down." How'd that go for you, Joanne? But I don't know. I think the attempts to shut it down obviously did not work. On July 26th, UQ sent me an email requesting I attend a disciplinary meeting on July 31st for matters ostensibly unrelated to the protest. Conveniently, the day the university knew we had scheduled the next demonstration. Given Joanne's comments on the 25th, I think this was clearly an attempt by senior university administration officials to use whatever leverage they had on me to stop me from protesting. And that was not the end to it. So sadly, threats to our enrolment as students were also made. So in a security meeting that took place at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, July 30th in Steve Dixon's office on level 5 of the Prentice Building, UQ officials gave us a list of draconian conditions to comply with if the protest was to be allowed to go ahead. One of these conditions was that we move the protest from the Great Court, the symbolic heart of the university and the busiest place on campus, to a nondescript location behind a car park. This was to ensure student safety, but I think we all know why the university was trying to do that. They were basically trying to starve the protest of oxygen, starve it of visibility. Then Steve Dixon said in a comment whose veracity can be attested to by the 2 other students that were present at the meeting, Jai Davis and Maddie Taylor. He said, "We like you being students at the university and we want this to continue into the future." So as a bunch of undergraduate students attending a meeting with security officials, the atmosphere was already quite intimidating for us. And in the context of that, we read that sort of comment by Steve as a veiled threat to our future enrolment as UQ students. Ultimately, I'm deeply saddened that UQ has decided to crack down on students rather than reevaluate its ties to a tyrannical and genocidal government, hostile to free speech and open inquiry, values that any reputable university should hold dear to its heart. UQ's Confucius Institute remains open. To this day, Brisbane PRC Consul General, Zhu Ji, is listed as a visiting professor attached to the Confucius Institute. This is despite the fact that he publicly endorsed the violent attacks against students on July 24th, praising the spontaneous patriotism of the students that attacked us. And he is a professor of the university, basically endorsing violence against students because they're critical of the Chinese government. UQ also still maintains links with honorary Professor Heng Taoshen, an academic that was attached to the Confucius Institute for some years. And this is a man that was involved in the construction of the Chinese state's totalitarian surveillance architecture in Xinjiang, where a genocide is currently taking place against Muslim minorities. This man set up his own company, Koala AI, and it has provided surveillance technology to the Chinese state to monitor and watch Uyghurs in their homes and allow the Chinese state to round up Uyghurs and commit them to the concentration camps. And the University of Queensland is still closely tied with this individual. He's an honorary professor at the University of Queensland. Now, we were not the only people at all to receive this type of pressure from the university. The Hong Kong students as well have faced a lot of threats from being told that they had to move their Lenin Wall because it was making students uncomfortable, to refusal, I guess, to protect it. It's been attacked four times, on four separate occasions the Lenin Wall has been attacked, despite the fact that UQ has 24/7 hour security, which I guess sort of raises questions. Is the university interested in protecting the Lenin Wall? So the Hong Kong students have faced tremendous pressure of their own at the hands of the university. So now I'd like to invite Jack, and he's the leader of the Hong Kong students, and he helped to organise the protest on the 24th that went violent. I'd like to invite Jack to the stage, and he's just going to say a few words on behalf of Hong Kong students.
Hey guys, is it working? Hello. I'm wearing this helmet because it's a symbol of protest in Hong Kong, and because we don't feel safe anymore to protest in UQ, and to make myself a taller, obviously. I'm one of the Hong Kong students who've been organizing protests in UQ and in the Brisbane City since mid-June. We've been showing our support to Hong Kong, expressing our concerns on the deterioration of democracy and freedom of speech in Hong Kong. Since June, there have been 1 million, 2 million people taking the streets in Hong Kong and protesting about to the government and the police. And we as international students would like to show our support to Hong Kong even though we are in overseas. Our protests were peaceful and non-violent, and we welcome any discussion at first, but it has turned aggressive since Market Day, which I believe you are all aware of what happened. Our students have been violently attacked by aggressive Chinese students. We were surrounded by a few hundreds of them, where they sang the national anthem and shouted at us. Our personal information has been leaked online afterwards. Our names, our faces, our personal details like student IDs and passports. This threatened our rights to express our opinions and threatened us, our personal safety. And the university has not done their part to protect us. Not a single one of our victims has been contacted by them immediately after the incidents. They only launched an investigation several weeks after the incident that they still have trouble identifying the person involved and responsible for attacking us. Our Lenin Wall has been torn down countless times at night, and even in broad daylight. The university did nothing to punish those students. What they've been saying around is that they can't tell us the progress of those investigations and the results because of the confidentiality. But we are the victims here. We got assaulted, and our property at the Lenin Wall got ripped down. We deserve to know what's happening with the investigation. We deserve to know what are the consequences of those students. And other students need to know what are the results and the consequences if they finally assault others because they have different opinions and even tearing apart, ripping down other people's stuff. I'm sure that the Market Day incident is one of the first few clashes between Hong Kong and Chinese students overseas about the extradition bill in Hong Kong. And there are lots of clashes happen elsewhere in universities in New Zealand, in Australia, Canada, and America. What we've been seeing is that those universities respond so differently and quicker than UQ. The University of Auckland has immediately launched an investigation after the clash is there. And there are even news saying that the responsible students got expelled from the university. And other universities have placed extra security right after the clashes or right after the resetting of the Lenin Walls. It's not like UQ who've been trying to get rid of all the responsibility. They've been trying to move our Lenin Wall to a building that they are not responsible of. Trying to convince us to move indoors, to make us less visible. Trying to persuade us to talk to those students who attack us, to reconcile with them. And even trying to lay the blame on us for the campus, as one of our students shouted at the teacher, who did not stop her students from ripping down our Lenin Wall. We expect the university to do more to protect us, as we felt scared after all those clashes. the university has done so little. This morning, the federal government has announced that they are investigating foreign interference of Australian universities. And they've been removing Confucius Institute in New South Wales. But UQ is doing otherwise. The statement from UQ regarding what the university has done after the clashes was just words. We hope to see real action from UQ to protect us and freedom of speech. But no matter what threats we receive, we will keep fighting for our beliefs. We're having a rally on this Saturday evening in the city to support democracy, to fight for democracy. See you all there. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew and Jack, for those remarks. To the main event. Professor Clive Hamilton, a member of the Order of Australia and Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, is Professor of Public Ethics at Charles Sturt University in Canberra. Prior to taking up this role, he was the founder and director of the Australian Institute, the country's most influential progressive think tank. Clive is also the author of well over a dozen best-selling books covering diverse topics, including climate change, economics, political freedoms and protests, and most recently, the influence of the Chinese Communist Party in Australian institutions. On a more personal note, Clive is fantastic to work with, and we've found him to be both very generous with his time and resources, and very egalitarian in his dealings with us as undergraduate students, and willingness to come and visit and put on this event. So, would you please make him feel very welcome by putting your hands together.
Thanks, Hamish. I really appreciate the invitation and that welcome that you've just done. And so thanks to the Politics, Philosophy and Economics Society for doing all the work that's necessary to go into an event like this. So, as you know, recent events at the University of Queensland have brought into sharp relief the Chinese Communist Party's influence activities on Australian campuses. Tensions arising from the mass protests in Hong Kong have prompted democracy activists in the West to speak out. But they have also inflamed nationalist sentiment amongst some Chinese students to the point where here and in other places around the world, they have engaged in angry confrontation and even violence against pro-Hong Kong protesters. And this has left many Australians asking what's going on. So I hope tonight to give some context that helps to explain and understand recent events. In particular, I will suggest, uncomfortable as it may be in these hallowed grounds, that the University of Queensland has itself created an enabling environment for the aggressive counter-protests that we saw. In Silent Invasion, I argued that the Chinese Communist Party has, for some 20 or so years, been engaged in a systematic campaign to shift elite opinion in Australia so that decision makers act in ways conformable with Beijing's wishes. The elites include those who run our universities. The CCP has a deep understanding of the importance of ideas and ideological struggle in the contest for political power. So ideas and those who generate them are a central target of the CCP's global influence work. While much of the debate on campuses has focused on Confucius Institutes, the party's global thought management, as it calls it, its thought management project is much more ambitious and is pursued through many subtle channels at foreign universities. Just to provide a quick list, there's direct lobbying from Chinese embassies and consulates. It doesn't take much for the local Consul General in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane to get on the phone to the Vice-Chancellor. The usual unspoken threat of cutting off the flow of cash from Chinese students. Threats usually implicit to cancel joint programs and lucrative executive training classes. Confucius Institutes themselves, of course, threats to withhold visas from academics and researchers who might be critical of the CCP. And within the China scholarly community, there is widespread self-censorship, which the more enlightened ones are willing to own up to. And of course, encouraging Chinese students to report on university activities and to organise protests. They're the kind of negative, oppressive activities that are carried out, but there are also more persuasive measures inviting academics and university executive conferences and banquets and building friendships and general guangxi so that a system of reciprocal obligation is set up, at least in the minds of the targets. University administrators have structural incentives to seek out cooperation agreements with Chinese institutions while knowing very little about the CCP's objectives and modus operandi. And so they often unwittingly facilitate the CCP's influence operations. To carry out this campaign of overseas influence, the CCP has, over some decades, built a complex network of agencies tasked with exerting influence abroad. Their work, known as United Front work, deploys sophisticated techniques to influence, persuade, and coerce others to act in ways approved by Beijing. These techniques have been defined over decades. They're actually set out and learned from manuals for cadres in the party. And they're far more extensive, intrusive, and secretive than those used by other nations. In the words of James Toe, a New Zealand expert who's written an astonishing book revealing this based on confidential documents in Beijing that he somehow, as a researcher, got access to, the psychological techniques used in United Front work are effective tools for intensive behavioural control and manipulation while appearing to be benign, benevolent and helpful. Under President Xi Jinping, United Front work has assumed much in the CCP's conduct of foreign relations. Xi has echoed Mao Zedong's description of United Front work as one of the party's three magic weapons. In the West, United Front work has traditionally been aimed at suppressing dissidents, winning overseas Chinese to the CCP cause, and mobilising them to act in support of Beijing's political and strategic interests. But over the last decade or so, United Front work has increasingly focused and been oriented towards promoting a more favourable view of PRC and the CCP in the Australian mainstream. Most of the effort has been directed at non-Chinese Australian elites, political, business, media and, of course, academic. In the words of a party newsletter fairly recently, the key targets of overseas influence activity are representative individuals with political influence, economic power, high social status and academic status, as well as communities. Now, this figure, a bit hard to read, but you'll get the kind of general impression, is a kind of organisational chart of the United Front Work Department, which is a department of the Chinese Communist Party, and it shows in the bottom part of it how that structure in China is mirrored and created and manifested in Australia. The United Front department falls under the aegis of the Politburo of the CCP Central Committee, and it has four main agencies, which you can see kind of arranged in fourth row there. The Overseas Chinese Affairs Office, very important, the China Overseas Friendship Association, the China Council for Promotion of Peaceful National Reunification, and the All China Federation of Returned Overseas Chinese, or AFROC. And this last agency, which is one formally of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, you have to get used to a lot of acronyms here, the CPPCC, which is hard to keep up with. But this is a larger political advisory body run by the United Front Work Department, and its membership includes overseas Chinese who direct United Front bodies in countries like Australia, or who use their wealth to acquire political influence. Now, the China Council for the Promotion of Peaceful National Reunification, this one here, has been especially important for work in Australia, where it is represented by the Australian Council for the Promotion of Peaceful Reunification with China, ACPPRC. And the ACPPRC, this organisation here, has been described by perhaps Australia's, or certainly one of Australia's, 2 or 3 top United Front experts, Jerry Groot at the University of Adelaide, as the overarching organisational vehicle in Australia for helping coordinate smaller bodies, and there are large numbers of those. Now, media attention on the activities of the ACPPRC and its controversial former president, Huang Zhangmo, who is now banned from entering Australia because of his suspected links to the Chinese Communist Party, and who's been popping up in the papers recently because he walked into the main office of the New South Wales branch of the Labor Party carrying an Aldi bag containing $100,000. He has been instrumental in raising public awareness of the United Front in Australia. It was Sam Dastyari's association with Huang Zhangmo that led to Dastyari's downfall. The ACPPRC has state-based subsidiaries, with Tasmania being the last state to set one up. That was in October 2017. Now, in this third box, other overseas Chinese associations, we find a range of United Front organisations. There are several groupings one might put them into: hometown associations like the Shanghainese Association, business associations, ethnic Chinese professional and scientific associations, such as the Federation of Chinese Scholars in Australia, or FOCSA, I'll come back to that, and cultural and religious groups, such as dance troupes, writers' organisations, and certain Buddhist sects. The CCP influences, guides, and in some cases controls all kinds of cultural and religious groups like that. And of course, we have the CSSAs, the Chinese Students and Scholars Associations here, and Confucius Institutes on the end. Now, so let me turn to Confucius Institutes. Although they are ostensibly devoted to teaching Chinese language and promoting Chinese culture, they are in fact a part of the party's broader program of what it calls discourse management abroad. And so the former propaganda chief of the party, Li Changchun, has said that Confucius Institutes are an important part of China's overseas propaganda setup. And he also said in that speech, using the excuse of teaching Chinese language, everything looks reasonable and logical. In 2010, the then Minister of Propaganda, Yu Yunshan, was reported as saying, we should actively carry out international propaganda battles. We should do well in establishing and operating overseas cultural centres and Confucius Institutes. A recent report by Dalian University's Communist Party Committee is revealing the university, which is in Liaoning province, trains many teachers sent abroad to staff Confucius Institutes. And the report in question was prepared for the central office of the United Front Work Department in Beijing, and it concerns the innovative United Front work that Dalian University is undertaking. The party committee writes that the university has actively developed new approaches to United Front activity abroad. As part of its United Front efforts, it has established 10 Confucius Institutes overseas since 2007. And it says that Dalian University Confucius Institute staff have promoted the Confucius Institute brand and blazed a new path for United Front work overseas. That's a scoop. That's not been reported anywhere, in English at least, so you have it firsthand. Unlike Goethe Institutes or British councils and cultural institutions of other nations, Confucius Institutes are, I think, almost always at least, embedded in foreign universities. This gives them leverage over the host institutions. Selection of academic staff and the curriculum are decided in Beijing. Leading China scholar, probably Australia's leading China scholar, John Fitzgerald, until recently president of the Australian Academy of Humanities, he wrote, "Universities that accept Confucius Institutes on Beijing's terms, with all the compromises they entail, signal that they are willing to set aside academic principles to build good relations with China and indicate normal due diligence does not apply to relations with Chinese universities and firms." In the United States, the National Association of Scholars commissioned a thorough review of the institutes in 2007. It reported that many professors associated with the institute speak of, quote, immense pressure to stay on the good side of Confucius Institute directors and university administrators affiliated with the Confucius Institutes. And in March of this year, Human Rights Watch noted that academics reported pressure from senior administrators to avoid saying anything critical of China, and invitations have been cancelled for speakers who were invited to talk about sensitive topics. In addition, Human Rights Watch wrote, many academics expressed discomfort with the presence of Confucius Institutes on their campuses. They said the presence of such institutions fundamentally compromised their institution's commitment to academic freedom. Now, in some places, particularly in the United States, people have been waking up to the true nature of Confucius Institutes. Between 2015 and 2016, in Sweden, 3 of the 4 Confucius Institutes were shut down. In the US, over the last 18 months, at least 16 Confucius Institutes have been closed down, although since I wrote that, today I read about another one. So they're falling like flies in the US. Some say there's no evidence of political interference or censorship from Confucius Institutes. This is simply untrue. The head of the Hanban, the agency of the Chinese Education Department that manages Confucius Institutes, her name is Yu Lin. She said that teachers sent abroad must obey China's laws, and of course laws also govern speech and ideas in China. A number of reports make it clear that a range of topics that are uncomfortable for Beijing are simply off limits in any Confucius Institute. That doesn't stop them, for example, of holding seminars to promote Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative. That's somehow not political. But you'll never see them host a seminar on the treatment of Uyghurs, and we are aware that Confucius Institutes have been active behind the scenes trying to get universities, sometimes successfully, to disinvite the Dalai Lama, for instance. Everything a Confucius Institute does supports Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party. And there have been instances of active censorship. Late last year at Victoria University in Melbourne, the screening of a documentary critical of the Confucius Institutes was cancelled at the last moment. It's due to be held in one of the university's lecture theatres. And it became apparent from various documents that the director of the institute, the Australian director of the institute, warned the university that they're going to have a problem on their hands if they allow this documentary to be screened, and the university made up an excuse, basically lied, told the organisers that, sorry, double booked, and every other theatre at the university is booked as well. We can't accommodate you. In 2013, at the University of Sydney, it was accused of cancelling a visit by the Dalai Lama to avoid damaging its ties with China, including the funding it received from its Confucius Institute. For its Confucius Institute. When the event with the Dalai Lama was pushed off campus and the university forbade the use of the university's logo, Vice-Chancellor Michael Spence said it was, quote, in the best interests of researchers across the university. In 2018, Michael Spence would say that government and media concern about CCP influence in Australia was no more than sinophobic blathering. He's dismissed concerns about covert People's Liberation Army scientists, that is, scientists from PLA universities in China who come and work in Australian research labs and disguise their institutional affiliation and the fact that they are actually officers in the PLA. He's dismissed that, which has been shown to be happening in many Australian universities. He's dismissed it as anti-China hysteria. And you might have seen last weekend, he attacked those defending democracy and human rights as anti-China, xenophobic, and wanting a return to the White Australia policy. This was despite the fact that the demonstrators in question are, for the most part, of Chinese ethnicity or Tibetans or Uyghurs. The protests and the broader debate in Australia are not about race. They're about the Chinese Communist Party. Although the Chinese Communist Party works very hard every day to try to conflate the party with the people, the party with the nation, and people like Michael Spence fall for it. What is really regrettable about Spence's interventions is it's insulting to those people, the Uyghurs and the Tibetans and the pro-democracy activists and the Hong Kongese who want democracy, and he dismisses them as anti-China or wanting a return to the White Australia policy, which is an attempt to silence them. People who are speaking up against Beijing's oppression and subversion and often putting themselves in danger. And here we have this senior member of the academic elite in Australia trying to get them to shut up. Now, when Michael Spence says it's all xenophobia, anti-China hysteria, and the re-emergence of the White Australia policy, he is in fact mouthing the slogans put into his head by the CCP's propaganda department. Chinese diplomats and party organs like the Global Times repeatedly use exactly these phrases. Now, just having a look at the University of Queensland's Confucius Institute, the initial contract was signed in 2009, and of all the contracts for Confucius Institutes in Australia, the UQ one provides the most latitude to the Han ban. Article 4 stipulates that its scope includes, quote, other activities as proposed and approved by the Han ban HQ. In other words, the university allowed the Han ban in Beijing to approve whatever it wants. The Vice-Chancellor, Peter Hui, became a senior consultant to the Han ban in 2013 that's Michael Spence meeting the director of the top United Front body, Overseas Chinese Affairs Office. Now, in 2013, Professor Hui met with Han ban chief Madame Zhu Lin, who's notorious for arriving at the 2014 conference of the European Association of China Studies in Portugal, where she immediately seized all copies of the conference program, took them away, and had her staff tear out one page from the program, one that referred to a Taiwanese educational foundation, before returning them to the China scholars so that the conference could proceed. In 2015, UQ News announced that Professor Hui had been honoured by the Han ban as the Outstanding Individual of the Year. This prestigious award, as UQ News called it, was, quote, in recognition of his contribution to the global Confucius Institute network. China's Vice Premier, Madame Liu Yandong, presented the award herself. In July of this year, the Vice-Chancellor led a UQ delegation to China, where he met, he went to Tsinghua University, where he met the party secretary, Chen Zhu, and you should bear in mind that in China, the party secretary is the most powerful person on campus, more powerful than the president of the university. The deputy director of the Central United Front Work Department a couple of years ago said that Tsinghua University has, quote, a glorious tradition of doing United Front work. Now, also in July of this year, Professor Hui told the Australian newspaper that the role of the, I've skipped that bit, but the role of the UQ Confucius Institute is to promote the learning of Chinese language and culture and a broader understanding of China at the university and in the community. But is it? Is that its role? When we look more closely at UQ's Confucius Institute, we notice something quite odd. From its early days, all parties involved emphasised the Institute's role in scientific exchange. According to the Hanban's website, enhancing technological change between UQ and Chinese universities, particularly its partner, Tianjin University, is part of the UQ's Confucius Institute, quote, cultural activities. Enhancing scientific exchange is part of the Institute's cultural activities. As UQ's Deputy Vice-Chancellor from 2009, Max Liu was closely involved in developing technological exchanges between UQ and Tianjin University through the Confucius Institute. Max Liu is a leading nanotechnology expert, and in 2017 he became the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Surrey, but he remains an emeritus professor at UQ. In 2004, Max Liu was the founding president of FOCSA, the Federation of Chinese Scientists in Australia, which is a peak body of professional associations for ethnic Chinese scientists in this country. In October of that year, the People's Daily celebrated the launch of FOCSA, noting that it began, quote, with the energetic support and aid of the Chinese Embassy in Australia's Education Office. China's ambassador to Australia at the time, Fu Ying, was reported in Chinese as saying that she hoped that the specialists and scholars would be able to transfer advanced technological achievements back to China. FOCSA has held its meetings often in the Education Office of the Embassy in Canberra. So this raises the questions about the role of the Confucius Institute at the University of Queensland. The People's Daily described UQ's Confucius Institute as, quote, the Confucius Institute of Science and Technology. So it's not just about teaching language and culture, it's also about facilitating the transfer of technology to China. And this explains the backgrounds of some of the senior people associated with the Institute. When you look at who the fellows and board members and so on are, particularly the fellows associated with it, you see people who don't seem to have anything to do with Chinese language or culture. You have one specialising in process metallurgy, one has a chair in nanoscience, one is a water treatment expert. He's also the current president of FOCSA. The new Tianjin University representative on the UQ Confucius Institute team, Professor Cui Jian Duo, is intimately involved in military, civilian, helicopter development and drone technology. So I think this gives some context to the news story earlier this week in The Australian reporting that a University of Queensland professor, Shen Heng Tao, created a company that develops advanced artificial intelligence technology that's being used for surveillance of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Professor Shen developed the technology, and the company that markets it, Koala AI Technology, wonderful name, he developed this while receiving generous ARC funding at the University of Queensland. He had been recruited by Beijing's Thousand Talents program, which some US government agencies and universities have banned staff from joining because of concerns about unauthorised IP transfer. Professor Shen is now in China, but he remains an honorary professor of the university. Now, recently, UQ has been criticised for appointing the Chinese Consul General Zhu Ji as an adjunct professor of language and culture. According to the website of the Chinese consulate in Brisbane, UQ's adjunct professorship is given to, quote, very few scholars who play unique roles and make significant contributions, as well as prominent individuals, and to date only given to a very few. Curiously, while defending the decision to appoint the Consul General, Professor Hui reassured us by saying that Professor Zhu would not be doing any teaching. Well, if he's of sufficient authority to be a visiting professor, why can't he give some lectures? It's strange, particularly in the light of the following fact. I had believed that the appointment of a serving diplomat to a professorship was unprecedented, but it turns out that Zhu Ji is not the first Chinese diplomat to be honoured with a professorship at UQ. In 2014, UQ appointed the then Chinese Consul General in Brisbane, Zhao Yongchen, as an adjunct professor in language and comparative literature. And in 2015, Professor Zhao gave a lecture at the university on prospects for Chinese-Australian cooperation. Chinese students are a CCP pressure point on campuses around the world, but particularly in countries like Australia, US, Canada, New Zealand, where their numbers are substantial. They are part of the party's United Front activities. At the seminal 2015 United Front Work Conference, General Secretary Xi Jinping defined Chinese students studying abroad as one of the 3 new focuses of United Front work. Many overseas Chinese students belong to Chinese Students and Scholars Associations, CSSAs. Now, much of the activity of CSSAs revolves around social events and student support, like other student societies. And that's all many Chinese students want. Many, perhaps most Chinese students on Australian campuses really don't want to get involved in politics and would really prefer to keep it at arm's length. But the CSSAs also help to monitor and regulate the speech and activities of Chinese students on Australian campuses. If a student expresses support for democracy or takes an interest in the Dalai Lama or criticises the CCP, even in private conversation with their friends, then it's likely that his or her parents, as we heard earlier, in China will be visited by the Ministry of State Security and warned to keep their child in check. And you really do not want to get a visit from the Ministry of State Security in China. PRC students surveilling and reporting on each other in class is of widespread concern. In recent studies, several professors across the US reported that they assume that their students are reporting on each other. Some said that Chinese students, individuals, had approached them directly in their offices and so on about their concerns about being surveilled and denounced. Many CSSAs report on their website that they are recognised by, registered with, or even subsidised by the local Chinese embassy or consulate. Why the universities allow CSSAs alone amongst all student clubs not to make their finances transparent, I don't know. Office holders of CSSAs typically owe allegiance to the party and liaise regularly with the embassy or the consulate. Their meetings are sometimes held in the consulate. And it's through them that Chinese students on campuses can be mobilised to demonstrate patriotic support during visits of Chinese leaders or to counter activities that the CCP thinks of as hostile. One effect of organised Chinese nationalism, if we can call it that, on Western campuses is bullying and harassment of students who stand for different visions of China than the one prescribed by the CCP, or who simply don't subscribe to party orthodoxy. One manifestation of that in Australia was the extraordinary demonstrations or protests which turned violent in Canberra in 2008, when some 20,000 students were bussed in by CSSAs working closely with consulates, embassies and wealthy patriotic businessmen. Elsewhere, we have seen at the University of Maryland when one Chinese graduate, Yang Shuping, used her graduation speech to praise what she called the fresh air of democracy in the United States and freedom of speech. She was hounded and threatened online, and her family in China was harassed until she issued a fawning public apology. She's forever marked. At the University of Toronto, when students elected a Tibetan Canadian, Kemi Lamo, as president of the Student Union, she received death threats and rape threats from Chinese students on campus, possibly prompted and certainly praised by Chinese diplomats. While some of these activities may be organised independently by students, in other cases they are clearly initiated by or coordinated with Chinese embassies and consulates. For instance, at McMaster University in Canada, students there contacted the Chinese embassy to report a planned talk by the Uyghur activist Ruqiyi Turush, which was then disrupted. The talk was disrupted and they later sent photos of the talk to the embassy. Chinese students, incidentally, have proven particularly belligerent in Canada, because the atmosphere there is even more lax than in Australia. Around the world, Chinese embassies and consulates, in coordination with local United Front bodies, have been encouraging and organising counter-protests against those supporting the democracy movement in Hong Kong. And in some places, these counter-protests, as you've seen, have been aggressive and even in a couple of cases violent, with pro-democracy supporters in fear of being photographed and reported with repercussions for themselves and their families in China, mainland China or Hong Kong. This more confrontational approach of the Beijing loyalists has been actively encouraged. In March this year, a former politics lecturer at Tsinghua University in Beijing, Wu Qian, said that a newly aggressive stance towards critics is part of a more muscular diplomacy that goes with the Belt and Road Initiative. Diplomats have been instructed to redefine the norms of international relations with what he called aggressive and tough behaviour. He went on, they are trying to establish an authoritarian world order that is subject to China, and which doesn't allow any criticism or opposing voices, neither at home or internationally. Probably not necessary to say that he's been fired from Tsinghua University. This shift helps explain otherwise bizarre behaviour by certain Chinese nationals. For example, in Birmingham in England last year, a Chinese state media journalist launched an unprovoked attack on a UK Conservative Party member at its annual conference. The journalist, Kong Lin Lin, stood up at a side event and launched a tirade against Hong Kong traitors and then slapped Enoch Liu, who was from Hong Kong. She just slapped him. And she was charged with common assault, but the Chinese embassy and state broadcaster CCTV turned her into a victim and demanded an apology. And Kong Lin Lin returned to Beijing a hero. While these actions, such as Kong Lin Lin at a Conservative Party conference just slapping someone might seem counterproductive to us. It's important to remember that Chinese nationalists who engage in patriotic attacks overseas are lauded in China and rewarded for their expressions of patriotism. CCP propaganda organs have been ramping up the patriotic rhetoric, egging on overseas Chinese to engage in aggressive pushback against pro-Hong Kong protesters. At the University of Tasmania, nationalist students have repeatedly torn down Lennon walls, as they have here and University of Sydney and elsewhere. The CSSA at the University of Tasmania published a statement calling on the university to, quote, build a clean and pure learning environment for students by stopping Hong Kong protests and banning Lennon walls. The Tasmanian CSSA has very close links with the local chapter of the ACPPRC, Wang Yangmo's former organisation. The head of the Tasmanian branch of the ACPPRC is a man called Wang Jinde, or Master Wang, the leader of a wealthy Buddhist sect in Hobart. A week or two ago, he reposted an article calling for pro-democracy protesters to be killed. Some vice-chancellors still say that when Chinese students come to Australia, they learn to appreciate the value of democracy and free speech and return to China to spread the word as Friends of Australia. How long will it take them to understand that this is wishful thinking? Some students do, of course, value the freedoms here, but if they then took their new values back to China and started to spread them, they wouldn't last a month before they ended up in the slammer. Chinese parents send their kids to Australia hoping that they will meet Australian friends, that they will make friends with Australians and people from other countries around the world when they're studying at university. And they're disappointed when the kids come back and say that they only hang out with fellow Chinese students. Universities seem to do nothing to break down the ghetto mentality that Beijing actively promotes through CSSAs and the activities of consulates. They aim to keep Chinese students away from other international and domestic students. As the China scholar John Fitzgerald wrote, Chinese students feel they are being hosted by the Chinese government in Australia. So we've seen on the UQ campus that mainland students who summon the courage to support Hong Kong protesters, and all power to them, they have to hide their identities. We know that one who attended one of the protests was identified, and her parents received that knock on the door. After nationalist students attacked pro-Hong Kong protesters on the campus, China's Consul General, as we heard, Zhu Ji, praised, quote, the spontaneous patriotic behaviour of Chinese students. The Foreign Ministry in Beijing fully supported the Consul General's criticism of, quote, a very small number of people with ulterior motives conducting anti-China separatist activities. Allegations that China is interfering in another nation's internal affairs, the Foreign Ministry said, are fabrications and slanders. As far as we know, Vice-Chancellor Hui did not discipline UQ Professor Zhu Ji for endorsing violence on the campus. That was left to Australia's Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, who rebuked him for not respecting the right to freedom of speech in Australia. The Global Times, the party's nationalist tabloid, reporting of the protest was a masterclass in how to turn events inside out. It wrote, patriotic Chinese students only wanted to, quote, give themselves a voice against, quote, foreign separatist groups colluding to disrupt China's peace and stability. Endorsing the Consul General's vow to stand against any instigation of anti-China sentiment, it quoted one patriotic student at UQ saying, quote, I will definitely fight back if I see anyone spreading separatist rhetoric on the street. And it finished by quoting a Shandong academic who said, freedom of speech can only work within the framework of political correctness. So all of this helps to put in context the protest on the campus on the 24th of July that turned ugly. Two things about events and the subsequent events struck me. The first was the way in which the university reacted. Its statements were anodyne calls to respect free speech, indicating it wouldn't be taking sides, thereby imposing a moral equivalence on the pro-democracy and pro-Beijing protesters who planned and initiated the violence. It's a bit like President Trump's response to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. Moreover, experienced observers believe that the pro-Beijing protesters were not led by students, but by heavies sent by the consulate, probably MSS agents in Australia. If so, then the attempt to intimidate and silence pro-Hong Kong protesters was, on the face of it at least, a violation of Australia's new foreign interference law. It's now a crime for anyone to engage in contact that, 1, is directed by a foreign power, 2, is covert and involves menace, and 3, is intended to influence the exercise of a democratic or political right in Australia. And the penalties are heavy. The second thing that struck me was an extraordinary incident that took place a few days later when a university security guard confronted 3 men tearing down a Lenin Wall. The men refused to show student IDs. And when the guard indicated that if they didn't, he'd call the police, the leader of these 3 men said, "I don't care if you call the police, I will call the ambassador." Now, these men, students or otherwise, felt entitled to go to the campus, this campus, there to engage in intimidation and tear down political messages, and believed that the authority to be on campus came not from university authorities, but from the ambassador, which probably means the consulate. The UQ nationalist protests and the street protests in Sydney and Melbourne are part of a worldwide campaign orchestrated by Beijing. It's activated United Front networks, including CSSAs, which it has built up carefully over many years. UQ has been an easy target, I think, because the university has for some years been signalling, just as Professor Fitzgerald said, that whatever Beijing wants, it can have. And this has created the enabling environment for the protests to turn aggressive. Patriotic Chinese students and the Brisbane consulate feel that they own the campus, so that they were particularly affronted when pro-Hong Kong protesters decided to express their view. So to finish, let me just make this last point. Incidentally, for those who accuse me of being xenophobic, this is the Chinese translation of my book, which is selling like hotcakes in Taiwan and Singapore and Hong Kong and indeed in Australia. Vice-Chancellors in Australia are quick to say they support free speech and academic freedom. In truth, the corporatisation of the tertiary sector and the extraordinary dependence of many universities on revenue flows from China, coupled with a sustained and highly effective influence campaign directed at senior university executives by various United Front bodies, has meant that many Vice-Chancellors and other senior executives have lost sight of the meaning of academic freedom. We have yet to see one Australian university draw a line in the sand and make it clear that it is willing to take the pain in defence of academic freedom and free speech on campus. Instead, all we have are more fine words without real commitments. A principle is worthless unless we are willing to sacrifice something for it. Unless we're willing to make that sacrifice soon in defence of academic freedom, Australia's universities will live under the ever-darkening shadow of Beijing. Thank you.
Thank you very Hamilton, for your speech. So we'll move straight into some questions from the audience. I would just like to encourage everybody, please, to think of a way to compose your question as a question and not a statement. Just keep them succinct and relevant so that we can get through a few. Mr. Hamilton, can I invite you to join me on stage over here?
Sure.
Thank you.
You might want to take a few questions and then I can respond. Take 3.
So just while I give everybody a moment to think of them, I thought I might just ask an initial question to begin. Just on the concluding note about your book, I just wondered if you might tell us a little bit about the difficulties you had getting your book published here in Australia.
Yes, well, perhaps some of you know the story, but when I went to my normal publisher, Allen & Unwin, in 2016, after the Dastyari affair and various other revelations, and I decided there's a book, an important book to be written here. A year later, well, Allen & Unwin was extremely enthusiastic. They thought it was a very important story to write about. They knew it was a problem, but I sent them the final manuscript that had been edited, copy edited, legaled, and so on. It was about to go to the printer, and they rang me up and said, "We're not going to publish it because we are afraid of retaliation from Beijing." So this was, and they had published 8 or so of my previous books. It was a deep shock to me that here Australia's most admired and awarded independent publisher was saying, we are not going to publish a book critical of the Chinese Communist Party because we're afraid that the Chinese Communist Party will punish us. It's a book about freedom of speech. And I had no publisher, and it was a very stressful time because other Australian publishers, for the most part, ran a mile. They weren't ringing me up the next day saying, we'll take it. None of them did. And there was a couple of months there when I couldn't find a publisher, and I was starting to look overseas. And that's when I made contact with Hardy Grant, a small but fantastic publisher in Melbourne, that said, we believe in free speech, we're going to publish this book. And that's how it emerged.
Fantastic. Incidentally, they were the same publishing house that published Spycatcher.
Yeah, there's this fantastic story that, the publisher, Sandy Grant, in the late 80s, he worked for Heinemann, and he was the person who was tasked with trying to publish Spycatcher by a former British MI5 agent who went to Tasmania and wrote a huge expose. The British government tried to stop publication, and when it was a massive case, and when it got to the High Court, the barrister that the publishers had turned out to be not very good, and so they hired a young gun, up-and-coming barrister, Malcolm Turnbull, and that's how Malcolm Turnbull made his name.
Thank you. If you could indicate just with your hands, yeah, I'll just come around with a roving mic. Drew, you'd like to begin with your question?
Drew's had his say.
I know you said no statement, I prefer any statement.
You've had your say, Drew. Come on, there are plenty of people with questions. Let them ask.
I was going to say, on the 24th, Frank Wayne, one of the leaders of the Chinese National students, when we were attacked, during negotiations with the police, he said there are members of the crowd that are not students, and I can't control them if you don't apologise to the Chinese nation for offending the Chinese nation. If you don't apologise to the Chinese students for offending the Chinese nation, they'll hurt you. So that's what Frank Wayne said. So yeah, these were members of the crowd. Anyway, yeah, I'll give you the question.
Thank you, Drew. I'll start with you.
Thank you, Hamish. Mr. Hamilton, thank you for your lucid and very insightful lecture. I want to pick your brains on the role of history and demography in either smothering or furthering the influence of influence operations. Why I say that is in India we have
very much for the talk. My name is Jay. I'm a PhD student from Sydney University. And it seems to me that the problem is that Australian universities generally are open to influence from all kinds of sectors, the private sector, foreign governments. But this is the first time that the strategic rival of our main ally has as much power and influence as it does. So do you think that the way around this would be to have fundamental rights for academics and students so that it's not up to the arbitrary whim of a vice-chancellor to decide whether or not someone's allowed to speak or not?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your speech. My name is Tenzin. I was born in Tibet, based in India, and settled here in Australia just a year ago. Tomorrow will be my first anniversary, so I want to thank Australian people and government for letting me stay here. Thank you very much. My question to you would be, we have lots of Australian Tibetan citizens here. Tibetans are originated Australian citizens. And annually we have a protest, a peaceful protest against the Chinese government, not against the Chinese people, please differentiate. So we know that Communist Party is 90 million and Chinese people is 1.4 million, we can differentiate easily. And whenever we go for that protest, most of the Tibetans who have already got Australian citizens, not like any permanent resident, they hesitate to come out and speak. And when we ask them a question, they say, I want to go to Lhasa. You know Lhasa very well, where I was born. I was born in Lhasa. So do you think that the Tibetans as an Australian citizen should have more power? At least, the Australian government should do something about them. Why they have to fear? They are not in Tibet, they are in Australia. They fear to come out and speak. So can you say something about it? Thank you so much.
Terrific, thank you for those terrific questions. I think on the first one, thanks for that. I mean, Australia does not have much of a history of dealing with China, and the history we do have has been China under the CCP. But of course, China under the CCP has gone through a whole range of phases. I mean, it's become much more hardline and totalitarian under Xi Jinping. There was a period of considerable liberalisation in the 80s, and even in the 2000s, intellectuals and academics could speak out much more bluntly. But in the last 5 or 6 years, there's been an extraordinary crackdown on free speech and challenging ideas in the country. So we don't have a good history. We don't have a long history or way of understanding it. And in Australia, our perceptions and our attitudes and our motivations have been so heavily influenced by the economic relationship. I mean, it's the first thing that people mention. And I think there was a study the other day that said if a full-on trade war would lead to a decline in Australia's GDP by 0.3%. Presumably that's an annual, so instead of being 2.8%, it'd be 2.5%. And so I think we as Australians have to think about how much we're willing to sacrifice in order to try to prevent not the rise of China, but the spread of the power of a totalitarian state that wants to control the global discourse, including in this university right here. And if we have to sacrifice some of our future income, then, you know, I, for one, am willing to do it. I can't help making this point too. If you break it down to sector by sector, and we look at the sectors of the Australian economy that have become extremely dependent on China's market, like universities, like iron ore, like certain agricultural products, the wine industry, for example. The wine industry has gone through its extraordinary boom. I mean, they've been raking in the money over the last 5 or 6 years because suddenly Australian wines are massive in China. And a year ago, there was a kind of blip in the relationship, and wine exporters found that their boxes of wine were being held up on the wharves for a bit. And they started to complain, and this is terrible, you know, Foreign Minister, you must apologise for whatever you did. And I'm thinking, hang on, you guys, knowing the risks of dealing with the Chinese government, have allowed yourself to become super dependent for your super profits on a particular market, and it's now come back to bite you just a little bit. Don't start whinging. That's business risk. If you didn't understand that, if you didn't understand what Beijing can do to punish countries, then, you know, you shouldn't be in business. Do not ask taxpayers to bail you out because you took a risk. On fundamental rights in universities to reduce the power of VCs, university charters typically do have rights. By all means, they could be strengthened, but I think it's more subtle than that. I think the problem is that it comes down to academics willing to give up the rights or not defend them. And there's actually a fantastic, I mean, I dare say somebody will ask me about the Ramsay Centre, and I think it's a very interesting comparison because what's been remarkable is that academics, Tertiary Education Union, around Australia have been up in arms about Ramsay Centre. Scandalous, attack on academic freedom, how dare you? But have been completely silent about CCP influence on campus. And we're talking about an elephant versus a gnat in terms of the impact on academic freedom. Who are the victims of the Ramsay Centre, of taking a few white kids who may be infected with Western ideas? But who are the victims? Who are the victims of CCP influence on campus? I mean, we've seen who the victims are. The first set of victims at the University of Queensland in recent times. They're the pro-democracy mainland Chinese students. They are the Hong Kong students. They are the Tibetans and the Uyghurs. These people are the victims. It's their human rights that I'm worried about. I don't really care that much about some snowflake white kids who might be infected by Western ideas. I want to defend those people that I talked about who want Western ideas or universal ideas, who are defending liberal ideas. And just lastly on the Tibet and so on, what can be done, we really should be, and it follows directly from my last question, we really should be defending the rights of those oppressed minorities and the Democrats from China and Hong Kong and so on in Australia to argue their case, to protest on the streets and not be living in fear of what is a modern Stasi. I mean, so many Chinese Australians have helped me with my work. So many Chinese Australians have been involved in launching and promoting the Chinese language version of my book. Very few of them are willing to state publicly their views. Those who have helped me by giving me information and so on, they live in fear that they will be identified as an enemy of the state, and their 80-year-old mother in Shanghai will get that knock on the door, or their brother will have their business destroyed. I mean, this happens constantly. A large part of the Australian community lives with a constant state of low-level fear, and this is an offence on our democracy. And the authorities have an obligation to protect democracy by protecting the rights of those Australians.
Like you said, there were terrific questions, and we thank you for giving even more terrific answers. We'll move to another bank of three questions. I'd also just ask any women and girls in the room, if you do have questions, please consider putting up your hand, because it would be great. If you can introverse. I'll just here.
only see one side of the story. We never see the other side. What's your question?
No. Let him ask it. No. Let him ask the question, please.
There a lot of times we only see one side of the story. We never see the other side of the story.
Yep.
And that's the thing I feel here, not here, but when during my 10 years thing I feel it. I found that all the media, everywhere, we only report one side of the story. We never see the other side. And we may think Chinese are brainwashed, but because we were brainwashed and we are so immune to that, we normally see two sides of the story. It's very funny here that a lot of people tell Chinese that you shouldn't love your government, they are evil. And I'm happy with our government. You shouldn't be. That's very, very weird. You should ask Chinese, why do you like your government? And instead of saying that you shouldn't be allowed from your government. So I just want to go down that. Maybe talk to some of your Chinese friends and get some more information. And in terms of the protests, I'm not a student of YouTube, but I saw some videos. What happened on that day to me, personally, I feel angry. You know what? There's pro-democracy, as you call it. Pro-democracy Chinese yelling, Chinese kid, Chinese women, and fuck Chinese, and go back to China. In Chinese, not many Westerners know about it. That's why Chinese community got angry, and that's why a lot of them they got their personal information. So there's another side of the story I want to find out. And my question. No, I'm done with my question.
All right.
Sorry.
You've had a good go, but make it quick.
So my question is, I saw a lot of things you said. I want to know, where did you gather your information from? So that this does not turn into a conspiracy theory.
Thank you.
All right, so I'll just go to this community, and if I could just remind everyone, again, this is quite numerous questions, and if there are any women or girls who really appreciate giving me a question. I just want to make sure that you understand that democracy is not some Western conspiracy. In fact, you're right. Back in the 80s, when we had Hu Yaobang as the leader of China, he was a reformer. He wanted democracy. He wanted freedom of speech. So all your students of the mainland China, remember that name, Hu Yaobang. And I plead with you to support Hong Kong, because if Hong Kong goes, Australia will be even deeper trouble. And finally, Australia have every right to tell China that they owe us one. Because when Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, he was the first Western politician, and he was even an opposition. He was only an opposition member. He went to China and visited China. And if he didn't do that, you think China would be rich now? China wouldn't have international market now, because in those days it was all about now. It wasn't about economic export at all. Thank you.
All right, look, thanks very much for those questions. Just on the last, I mean, what can students do? I mean, I see students doing it right now. you know, as many of us in this area say, the most powerful weapon that Western democracies, any democracies, can have is sunlight. And so the CCP loves operating in the shadows. I mean, you'll see just again today, with the arrest of the Chinese writer in charge for spying, you know, it's keep this behind the scenes, don't make it public, we'll negotiate it in private. But as Feng Chongyi, the Chinese-Australian academic at UTS, when he was banged up in China, and you know, Foreign Affairs and Bob Carr was saying, don't say anything, you know, Chinese government hates megaphone diplomacy. He was saying, no, the only way I'm going to get out of here is if people bring this to light and make a fuss. And so talking about it, writing about it, organising events about it, asking questions of your university administrations is the most powerful thing that students can do. Now, first of all, thank you, our friend here, for having the courage to come along tonight in this, you know, hostile audience and putting the point of view. That's fantastic. I really appreciate that. I just say your opening comment, I think, really captures the difference of view here. You said you perceive a lot of bias against China. I don't hear any bias against China. I hear bias and criticism, strong criticism, against the Chinese Communist Party. Some people out there in the media and elsewhere and society have started to talk about Chinese influence in Australia, and I would say, no, stop. We have had Chinese influence in Australia from about 1820, when the first migrant came from China, and that Chinese influence in Australia has been a really valuable contribution to the richness of our multicultural society. What we're worried about is Chinese Communist Party influence in Australia. That's the thing that we're focused on. And yes, a lot of people do see it as evil. You know, I was talking to the family member of a Uyghur person who was in a concentration camp in Xinjiang, and they said, this government is evil. I'm not going to argue against them. I think it's a very dangerous government run by a paranoid, dangerous party. And of course, the greatest victims of this are the Chinese people themselves. Now, of course, some Chinese people support the government as long as economic conditions continue to flourish. And they also support it because they feel that the government does represent the Chinese nation, and they feel patriotic and supported in those terms. Now, you've suggested to me that perhaps I should ask my Chinese friends, sorry, you walked into this one, to get an alternative point of view. Well, I have to say that a lot of this, you know, the kind of thoughts behind my book and what I've argued tonight have come from my Chinese friends. So there are obviously deep splits within, you know, there is no Chinese view of the world. Within the diaspora, the Chinese community in Australia, there's a really wide diversity of points of view. And so obviously my friends, mostly in those that, amongst that segment of the Chinese community in Australia that has no time at all for the Chinese Communist Party, they came here to get away from it, and they're deeply distressed that it somehow followed them here. And last point on the information, well, in my book, you know, the footnotes in that book drove me nuts. There are 2,000 of them. There is a version of this paper which has got 3 pages of footnotes, mostly from Chinese language sources. So, you know, my research, I'll stick by my research and I'll claim that the sources are good and the interpretation is thorough. Lastly, on Hu Yaobang, thank you again for pointing out the diversity of views within China and the fact that China as a nation, as a political entity, has been through some dramatic changes where sometimes the liberalising forces in the Communist Party and outside are dominant, and China looks as though it's shifting towards not Western values, universal values. But at times the hardliners win the day, and that's happened in the last 5, 6, 7 years, and that's why we're here tonight. It's not even the problem of the Chinese Communist Party as such. It's the fact that the hardliners, the hawks, the Stalinists within the Chinese Communist Party are now the dominant faction, and they're the ones causing the trouble. So, the hope for all of us is not to see the Chinese, massive social disruption. The best bet for all of us is that liberalising forces within the Chinese Communist Party will, through certain circumstances, gain the upper hand and bring the fresh air of free speech and open ideas back to China in a way that it has experienced at certain times over the last 70 years.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. We'll have to leave it there. But just before we conclude, I'd like to acknowledge some people who helped to make the event run smoothly this evening. So Gary Tyler and UQ Security for being present. Queensland Police who are also present. Sibylla Wilson and the Student Services team who helped to manage ticketing up the top. They were a real asset, so we really appreciate it. And all the student volunteers who assisted with behind-the-scenes preparations. On your way out, we would really encourage you to visit Avid Reader. They are a local Brisbane institution, well known for their promotion of all sorts of literature, and they're very committed to freedom of speech, and they will be selling books both in English and a Chinese language version, and so they're available for purchase outside. And finally, thank you to you, Clive. We really appreciate the effort that you've done.
Thanks very much.结束了，我去把我的麦克风拿回来。
你是那个 OZ Media 是吗？对，我有看你在网上那个。
你好，你好。
我是那个当事人，这是我拍的。
我知道你们。那个明天你们也在这儿吗？
什么？明天因为那个我有课，所以我是周6的那个活动。
哦，你还在这儿上学呢是吧？
对。
哦，那好，好，我们有机会再聊。好，可以联系到我。好，谢谢。
那个网上有你的电话。
好，谢谢，拜拜。有人认识我的，是不是？嗨，你好。
最近才开始看你，就是从那个上次那个24号那个冲突开始的
啊。
最近几天都有看你节目，还挺好玩的。因为前两天第8那些小五毛出来到你那个到那个直播间那种就带节奏那种，
是挺好玩。
百闻不如其解，挺好的。这谢谢你，也算是对我们这一代的就。也是一种启发吧，因为我现在觉得就中国这种洗脑教育真是更甚了，因为我们这一代其实很多人真的已经失掉思考能力。我觉得真的很感谢像你们这样的人，因为我自己说句实话，我都不是特别敢站出来，因为我就是这样24号之后我就跟他有联系，但是我也不方便站出来，因为我的朋友都是有很大一部分中国人了，我也不想你知道吧？
你在这儿上学的吗？
对，我今年刚毕业。最近在找工作，所以对，我今天找你来了，因为我看到因为我平时有教 private tutor。然后我6点钟才教完人，然后看着你的直播开始来不及了，我赶紧从 CD 赶过来的。对，一路跑过来，生怕那个错过了。对，真的很感谢你们这样人，也没有什么能帮得上忙的。
没关系，这个我们大家 越多看这节目，越多人了解这个事情，就能帮得上。
而且我也觉得，就是现在真的一个，相当于全世界的共识很好，真的是反中国跟反中共现在分得很开
啊，非常非常清楚。
我
觉得这个演讲太棒了。
对，我也觉得这个
让西方人、让澳洲人了解中共和中国是完全两个不同的概念。我们中国人完全是被绑架的。
中共这么多年来，他强制的把这种国家跟党绑在一起的这种理念，真是太恶心了。就是现在中国人就变得，我这一代就变得很敏感，你知道吗？就你只要说中国人，就是说我。
对。
家国理念绑得很紧的那种。
咱这个中国出来的孩子们都被深深的洗脑了，洗了几代人，没办法。
实话实说，我一开始我想我翻墙早，你知道吗？我初一初二的时候我就在翻墙，你要那个时候翻墙不像现在点一下。以前你要自己去设服务器地址，要设密码，经常断线，你知道吗？然后以前我刚出来的时候也是，就一人舌战港澳台群儒嘛，你知道吗？我说你说中文你不好，什么美国狗，我也是那样过来的。然后后来看了，你知道吗？看了台湾那边的节目啊，包括袁腾飞的，你知道吗？就是了解到正史了。
只要我们能有开放的这个消息来源，
现在收的太紧了。
其实啊，就是我觉得中国将来政权一倒，没有这种防火墙了，
对，
大家立刻就醒了。
现在真的是在引火自焚，现在的这种维稳费用军费都太夸张了。我觉得坑不了多，你不像美国，你美元能在全世界薅羊毛，中国就薅老百姓羊毛，再薅几年，现在老百姓不像以前40-50年真的傻，你说怎样就怎样，现在不是这样的，真的搞得最后树倒猢狲散。实际上也是期待着那一天，说句实话，真的，因为我现在觉得你说和平革命这种从自上而下根本是不可能的。
不可能，这种体制谁上去都是这样。
真的，我以前
不是说这个习近平上去换了一个人就能好，换谁都不行，必须把体制改掉。因为这个体制就培养这种垃圾。
是呀，就是垃圾嘛。我以前就觉得说，我以前看一些正史，我就觉得以后我要进共产党，我要怎么样。我后来发现根本就是
不行，真的，你要进了共产党你也那样。
对，我也那样。所以现在我也是嘛，因为其实我专业都不算是移民类的，就是不太想回国，就想在这边试一试。我真的是不想回去跟他们同流合污，你知道吗？
不行，回去也没办法。
是，真的是。但是反正不管怎么样，感谢你，也很高兴见到你。今晚还会看你的节目的。那我就那我就先走了。
好，拜拜。哎呀，还遇上一个算不算战友呢？树倒猢狲散。你看咱这人都挺清楚的，都很清晰，没有稀里糊涂的人，是不是啊？哪有稀里糊涂的人？哎呀，今天不过这个麦克风我不是很满意啊。小伙子价值观非常正，是吧？哎，真是没有那么多傻子。哎呀，我也打包我的东西吧。哎呀，咱们这个直播一直播着走，行不行啊？也省得有人给我上点什么小招数啥的，是吧？哎呀，我就背着这个东西走，行不行啊？我就给你们直播背着走，行吗？不知道黑天能不能行啊？我的天！好。今天人不多呀，才500多人看呀，是不是因为都学英语就不看了？你们真是的哎。一说英语就没人看了。谢哥是昆士兰大学老师吗？是的呀，我专门教吹牛的。哎呀，还有人慕名而来，看见我直播了，马上就跑过来了。我的妈呀！可能是他那个什么，可能也就是人家住在附近吧。哎呀 ，OK， 行了，我估计我以后变成大学常客了。你看我这来直播，竟然有这么多人认识我啊，好几个人。教吹牛的是吧？七哥专门教吹牛的。行，咱走。咱们就撤了，好不好？我把你们拎着走，好不好？我今天我也不想在这多继续逗留了，此地不宜久留。
Hope I didn't get in your way.
此地不宜久留啊！ 扯呼，大学教授细石先生啊，我专教吹牛学的。其实咱中国人要是教吹牛啥的，应该是基本上是不难吧，是吧？哎呀，2个小时就差2个小时就望驿了，是不是？哎呀，我能不能赶回去望驿去呢？这个是一个关键问题呀，是不是？有匪气是吗？哎呀，我给你看看人家这学校多漂亮啊！你看人家这学校，人家这学校里边这是工程学院，这个叫 Advanced Engineering Building， 工程，人家学工程的，人家大学里边这实验室，我的妈呀！我要是有这么一个工具房，可多好呀！不到2个小时了，那你们等着我吧，看我能不能飞回去，好不好？我看我能不能，我的翅膀还好不好用？快找公安！啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦！西哥帅不啊？你看，你们也真是，哎，你们太势利眼了。我这个有这么多警察呢，哇塞！看，警察给我们保安来了，这不是那个，这可不是什么。这可不是什么那个随便玩的那个活动是吧？我还得找找我车停哪儿了，这还不认识道了是吧？我来瞧一瞧啊。哒哒，我来找找这边。是不是这边？是这边走啊！对付了，天黑了，是不是？慢慢来啊，慢慢来。咱们先在大学里混个脸熟。哎呀，都黑天了，你们看不着我了是吧？哎呀，先在大学里咱们混个脸熟。刚才那个我后边我那个推特上发了一张照片。那小伙子上来先问我，哎，你是中国这边的还是香港这边的？哎，我很奇怪啊，看着他长得很奇怪，长得那个理的那个发型非常小粉红，然后我也不认识他，他在我相机背后跟我问我，那我得照张相啊，是不是？哎呀，照了好几张相，他终于把头抬起来了，哎，被我抓住了，行，照张相就行了，只要照张相咱。有个存档是吧？别哪天，跟踪我、暗害我啥的，那就不中了，是不是？你忙着看后背有没有人跟踪我，不用看，我这直播怕啥的？我直播还能直播咬我不成啊？今天天黑了啊，小粉红是什么发型？小粉红，哎呀我的妈，小粉红，你看见那个李宏宽那发型了吗？那就是小粉红的发型。其实这个三脚架不太溜索呀，哎，好了，溜索了。哎呀，李宏宽那发型就是小粉红。哇塞，这啥地方啊？我这也走错了吧？也走错了路呀！啊，瞧瞧那边是不是能通吗？哎， 这大学这校园就是哪儿都通，四通八达的，你走哪儿都行。找不到车了，哎呀，急死西哥了，我找不到。西哥开飞机来的，不用开车。喝，唱两句给自己壮胆儿。我那个吹哨是不是？吹哨给自己壮胆儿，是不是？那叫什么？走夜路吹口哨，是不是？自己壮胆儿吧。这什么小鸟？小鸟跟踪我吗？787来的，问问别人不用问。这大学咱熟，这都来好几趟了。以前不玩这个革命的时候，也经常来这个大学玩。这大学可漂亮了。注意安全，随身携带打狗棒，不用打狗棒。西哥带这个铝制三脚架，那上面全是钩子。哎呀，这三脚架也太硬了。600女朋友都陪着我呢，现在没有600女朋友啊，现在可真没有600，就是才745人，最多有1/3是女的，最多也就200人吧，是吧？200个女的，女生太少了啊。晚上开 lecture， 对呀，晚上开 lecture。大学里的 lecture 都是要课后的呀，不可能，尤其是这种非课题的 lecture， 不可能是白天开的吧？还有人给我打招呼呢。那小伙子认识我，那小伙子说：“西哥，我就看着你的频道来的。”带着女朋友，哎呀，人家带着个女朋友，我这女朋友也不说跟我来，你说你们真是的，净在远程看我了，是不是？也不陪我来玩来，女朋友你们太不给力了啊！行了，我不跟你们聊了，这个地方黑灯瞎火的，你们也看不着我，我也看不着，我也看不着什么都看不着，哇塞，那边还踢球呢，那边还有踢球的呢，那边踢球的，好了，752人，有600个女，不信，哎呀，肯定没这么多。你们待会儿我一问，男朋友都上来了，多尴尬呀！不能随便问的这个话题，一问你们都在这儿起哄，月黑风高是不是啊？有个反共的女朋友真好，是吧？好了，我不跟你们聊了，我该走了啊，拜拜！待会儿咱们网易热线见啊，今儿晚上还有网易热线，拜拜。